Hey friends, tonight we're diving into ancient Rome and Carthage, right into the middle of a war history called the Second Punic War. This was a time when everything came down to strategy, courage, and honestly, some completely questionable decisions. So, kick back, hit that like button, and subscribe. Only if you really want to see history the way I do here. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from and what time it is over there. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from across the globe. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for some soft background noise, and let's step together into the brutal and fascinating world of this ancient war. Hey friends, welcome back. Tonight, we're traveling back over 2,000 years to a time when the Mediterranean world was a boiling pot of ambition, power, and pure human stubbornness. We're diving into one of the most legendary conflicts of the ancient world, the Second Punic War, a war that would etch the names of Hannibal and Scipio Africanus into history forever. Before we get into the thick of it, let's set the stage. Picture this, it's the early 3rd century BCE. Rome is expanding fast, dominating the Italian peninsula and flexing its muscles across the Mediterranean. Across the sea, Carthage, a wealthy and fiercely competitive city-state in North Africa, is watching, calculating, and itching to protect its commercial empire. Tensions are high, and the spark for another war is just about to fly. Now let's talk about the people. On one side, you have Hannibal Barca, arguably one of the greatest military minds in history. This guy wasn't just brave, he was audacious, cunning, and frankly, a little bit obsessed. On the other side, Rome isn't just going to roll over. They've got experience, discipline, and a stubbornness that would become legendary. Think of Rome as a wall you can't easily knock down, and Hannibal as the guy bringing elephants, cavalry, and wild strategies to test that wall. So why should you care? Because this war wasn't just about battles or borders, it was about survival, ambition, and decisions that would echo for centuries. Hannibal didn't just fight with soldiers, he fought with ideas, psychology, and sheer nerve. And Rome adapted, learned, and eventually turned the tide in ways that still leave military historians in awe today. Now, a little background on Carthage. Located in what's modern-day Tunisia, Carthage was a maritime powerhouse. Its wealth came from trade, its influence from cunning diplomacy, and its culture from a mix of Phoenician traditions and North African heritage. Carthaginians were merchants, sailors, and warriors, and Hannibal came from a family that believed in one thing above all else: fighting Rome was destiny. His father, Hamilcar Barca, swore him to it as a boy, and Hannibal never forgot that vow. Meanwhile, Rome was a different beast entirely. Built on citizen soldiers, a complex political system, and an obsession with law and order, the Romans had a methodical approach to war. They weren't flashy, they were persistent. And persistent is exactly what you need when someone like Hannibal shows up on your doorstep with a marching army that includes elephants. The Second Punic War officially kicks off in 218 BCE, but it didn't happen in isolation. This was the sequel to a previous conflict, the First Punic War, which left Carthage bitter, eager to reclaim lost ground, and suspicious of Rome at every turn. Hannibal, growing up in this post-war tension, was molded by both revenge and ambition. By the time he was an adult, he was ready to take the fight straight to Rome's backyard. But here's the kicker, Hannibal didn't take the easy path. Instead of attacking Rome directly, he decided to cross the Alps with elephants, a feat so audacious that even modern armies look at it and shake their heads. Imagine thousands of men, dozens of elephants, treacherous mountains, and freezing weather, all just to get within striking distance of a city that's defended by some of the toughest soldiers the ancient world had ever seen. And that's just the beginning. Once Hannibal entered Italy, he started a campaign that would shock Rome to its core. He didn't just win battles, he changed the way wars were fought. And Rome, for the first time, realized it wasn't just facing another enemy, it was facing a force that was relentless, smart, and terrifyingly human. So, as we dive into the battles, strategies, and personal stories of this war, keep in mind, this isn't just a history lesson. It's a story about ambition, risk, and the lengths people will go to when destiny calls. And trust me, by the time we're done, you'll see why Hannibal and Rome's leaders still fascinate us more than 2 millennia later. Alright friends, that's our setup. Take a sip of water, maybe stretch a little, and get ready. The story is about to get wild. Alright friends, buckle up, because this is where the story starts to get really wild. Hannibal wasn't the type to sit back and wait. No, he had a plan, and it was bold, borderline insane. After taking command of the Carthaginian forces in Iberia, modern Spain, he started assembling an army that would make any modern general raise an eyebrow. Tens of thousands of infantry, thousands of cavalry, and, because why not, dozens of elephants all marching toward the Italian peninsula. Now, crossing into Italy wasn't just a walk in the park. We're talking about the Alps, a mountain range that even today can make experienced hikers second-guess themselves. Hannibal didn't just want to move an army, he wanted to surprise Rome. Rome expected a Carthaginian attack from the south via the Mediterranean. Hannibal came from the north. He wanted to hit Rome where it least expected. Genius, absolutely. Insane, definitely. Imagine the scene. Thousands of men trudging through snow, cliffs towering above them, icy winds cutting like knives. Elephants struggling to climb steep passes, some falling into ravines, some dying from cold and hunger. Hannibal's leadership was tested to the max. Supplies were scarce, morale was low, and yet somehow he kept his army together. The loyalty he commanded from his troops was legendary. Along the way, Hannibal also faced hostile tribes in the Alps. These weren't minor skirmishes, they were life-or-death encounters. He had to negotiate, fight, and sometimes even trick local warriors just to keep moving. Every day was a struggle, and yet history tells us that Hannibal lost fewer troops than you might expect, considering the harshness of the journey. Once Hannibal finally descended into northern Italy, the Romans got their first shocking taste of what was coming. The army that marched over the Alps, battered but unbroken, was ready to engage. And this is where Hannibal's strategic genius really shines. He didn't just rely on brute force, he used psychology, terrain, and timing to his advantage. His early victories weren't about slaughtering Rome's forces, they were about sending a message. We're here, and Rome isn't safe on its own turf. One of Hannibal's first major victories came at the Battle of Trebia. Here, he lured the Romans into a trap by exploiting their overconfidence. The river, the cold weather, and Hannibal's clever positioning led to a massive Carthaginian victory. And this was just the start. Hannibal understood that in order to beat Rome, he needed more than soldiers. He needed to break the Roman spirit. Next came the Battle of Lake Trasimene, another masterclass in ambush tactics. Hannibal used the landscape to hide his troops, striking the Romans when they least expected it. Fog rolled in, the Roman army found itself trapped between Hannibal's forces and the lake, and chaos erupted. Thousands of Romans were killed or captured, and Hannibal's reputation as an unstoppable force spread across Italy. What's fascinating here is how Hannibal managed to keep his army motivated despite being so far from home. Supplies were a constant issue, reinforcements were almost non-existent, and yet his soldiers trusted him completely. Hannibal's charisma, his promise of glory, and his unwavering determination made his men follow him into situations that would have broken most armies. But not everything was smooth sailing. Hannibal knew he couldn't lay siege to Rome directly. The city was too well defended. Instead, he hoped that his victories would inspire Rome's allies to defect. Some did, especially in southern Italy, but Rome's resilience surprised him. The Romans didn't crumble, they adapted. And this set the stage for a long, grueling war that would last over a decade. By the end of these early campaigns, Hannibal had already achieved what many generals could only dream of. He had crossed a mountain range thought impossible, won multiple battles against a formidable opponent, and brought the war to Rome's doorstep, all while keeping his army mostly intact. This wasn't just a military feat, it was a psychological masterpiece. Hannibal had proven that with audacity, strategy, and sheer determination, one man could change the course of history. And just when you think Hannibal might take a breather, he doesn't. He presses on, continuing to challenge Rome, testing every weakness he can find and keeping the tension high. This is where the real drama begins, and where Rome starts to realize that defeating Hannibal will take more than just brute force. It will take cunning, patience, and a lot of resilience. Alright friends, now we're entering a critical phase of the Second Punic War. Hannibal had dominated Italy for years, stunning the Roman world with his audacious strategies, brilliant battlefield tactics, and the seemingly unstoppable march of his army, even including elephants. But the Romans, as stubborn and resilient as they were, had not given up. They had learned the hard way that facing Hannibal head-on was a recipe for disaster. And so, Rome began to prepare a response that would eventually shift the balance of power. Enter Publius Cornelius Scipio, later known as Scipio Africanus, a young, ambitious Roman general whose vision would redefine how the war was fought. Scipio came from a distinguished Roman family and was no stranger to both military discipline and political maneuvering. Unlike the cautious strategies employed by Fabius Maximus, Scipio believed that Rome needed to go on the offensive in a completely different way. He realized that chasing Hannibal around Italy would only prolong the conflict and continue the draining losses Rome had suffered over the past decade. Instead, he formulated a bold plan: strike directly at the heart of Carthage itself. By 204 BCE, Scipio had raised and trained a formidable army, drawing on the lessons Rome had painfully learned from past defeats. He landed in North Africa, establishing a base and beginning to secure alliances with local tribes who had previously supported Carthage. Scipio's understanding of both logistics and diplomacy allowed him to operate in unfamiliar territory while still keeping the army supplied and motivated, a stark contrast to the long, exhausting campaigns Hannibal had led in Italy. This strategy was audacious. Hannibal, despite all his victories, could not match the Romans in sheer numbers indefinitely. Carthage itself had been weakened by years of conflict, the economy strained, and reinforcements limited. By threatening the city directly, Scipio forced Hannibal into a difficult position: leave the battlefield in Italy and return to defend Carthage, or risk the eventual loss of his homeland. And so Hannibal did what he had hoped to avoid. He marched back to Africa. For the first time in years, he faced a theater of war where the Romans dictated the terms. The young general Scipio, now rising as Hannibal's equal in strategy and audacity, had brought the war to a critical crossroads. The decisive moment came at the Battle of Zama in 202 BCE, a confrontation that would ultimately decide the fate of the Mediterranean world. Hannibal's forces, though battle-hardened, were exhausted from years of campaigning. Scipio, on the other hand, had studied Hannibal's tactics meticulously, prepared his troops, and arranged his formations to counter every Carthaginian advantage. The battlefield was set, and what followed became a textbook example of tactical genius and preparation. Hannibal initiated the battle with his infamous war elephants, intending to break the Roman lines and create panic. However, Scipio had devised an ingenious counter. He formed lanes in the Roman ranks that allowed the elephants to pass through without causing mass disruption. Roman soldiers were trained to step aside, strike the elephants if necessary, and maintain formation, nullifying one of Hannibal's most fearsome weapons. Once the elephants were neutralized, the battle became a clash of infantry and cavalry. The Romans, disciplined and organized, slowly gained the upper hand. Scipio's cavalry, allied with Numidian horsemen, engaged Hannibal's flanks, eventually enveloping the Carthaginian forces and forcing them into retreat. It was a combination of timing, discipline, and superior strategy that led to a decisive Roman victory. Hannibal's army, which had once terrorized Rome itself, was defeated in a manner that showcased the evolution of Roman military resilience and adaptability. The aftermath of Zama was dramatic. Carthage, forced into submission, accepted humiliating peace terms. They surrendered territories outside Africa, agreed to reduce their army, and were subjected to significant reparations. Rome, on the other hand, emerged as the dominant Mediterranean power, a status that would shape the politics, economy, and warfare of the region for centuries. Hannibal survived the battle but never regained the strategic initiative. He would spend the rest of his life in exile, remembered as one of history's greatest generals, defeated not because of a lack of skill, but because Rome adapted, endured, and struck at the right moment. Scipio Africanus, meanwhile, became the embodiment of Rome's evolution during this war. He combined intelligence, patience, and audacity, showing that victories are not only won on the battlefield but also through strategy, diplomacy, and timing. His campaigns in Africa demonstrated that Rome had learned the lessons of Trebia, Lake Trasimene, and Cannae the hard way and turned them into a decisive advantage. But the war was more than just generals and battles. Consider the human element. The soldiers who marched across continents, the civilians whose cities were occupied and threatened, the families waiting anxiously for news from the front. Hannibal's campaign in Italy had terrified the Italian peninsula, while Scipio's campaign in Africa brought uncertainty and fear to Carthage. The The Second Punic War was as much a story of human endurance, courage, and suffering as it was a story of strategy and tactics. The contrast between Hannibal and Scipio is particularly instructive. Hannibal's brilliance lay in his audacity and ability to innovate under pressure. He could take risks that others would avoid and inspire his men to achieve the impossible. Scipio's brilliance lay in his preparation, his strategic patience, and his ability to leverage Rome's strengths. Both were extraordinary leaders, but the eventual outcome demonstrates that persistence, adaptability, and learning from past mistakes can overcome even the most dazzling individual genius. After the war, Hannibal's legacy remained influential. Carthage was never a threat to Rome again, yet Hannibal continued to serve as an advisor and strategist in various capacities, always remembered for his tactical genius. Scipio's legacy, on the other hand, became a foundation for Roman military doctrine, influencing countless generations of Roman commanders, and ensuring that Rome would remain dominant in the Mediterranean for centuries. For modern audiences, the story of Scipio and Hannibal is a lesson in leadership, strategy, and human resilience. It shows that wars are won not just through courage, but through intelligence, adaptation, and the ability to read both the battlefield and the larger political context. The Second Punic War is remembered not only for its epic battles, but also for the lessons it imparts about endurance, vision, and the balance between audacity and patience. And as we reflect on this period, it's impossible not to appreciate the scale of the human endeavor. Thousands of men fought, suffered, and sacrificed. Cities were threatened, economies strained, and entire regions were transformed. Yet from this chaos emerged lessons that would shape the future of warfare and civilization itself. Hannibal and Scipio, despite being enemies, together created a story that would echo across the centuries, a story that continues to captivate historians, military strategists, and storytellers alike. Alright friends, now that Scipio Africanus has pulled off one of the biggest strategic turnarounds in ancient history, let's talk about what happened after the dust settled. Because the end of the Second Punic War wasn't just the end of a conflict, it was the beginning of a new world. The Mediterranean would never be the same again, Carthage would never recover its former power, and Rome would begin rising into the massive empire we all read about today. But before we jump into the big picture, we need to understand what the immediate aftermath actually felt like. Imagine two civilizations, Rome and Carthage, standing on opposite sides of a battlefield, one victorious, one shattered, both about to face consequences that would echo across centuries. Carthage after defeat, a city on its knees. When the Carthaginians realized they had lost at Zama, they weren't just defeated, they were humiliated. Rome didn't just win, Rome made sure Carthage understood exactly who controlled the board now. The peace treaty forced on Carthage was brutal, and designed to make sure Carthage would never threaten Rome again. Here's what Rome demanded. Carthage had to surrender almost all its overseas territories. They were forced to give up their navy. Almost every ship burned or handed over. They had to pay massive reparations in silver for 50 years. They could not wage war without Roman permission, even on their own continent. Think about that last one for a second. Carthage went from being one of the richest trading powers in the Mediterranean to basically being a regional city under constant surveillance. They weren't even allowed to defend themselves unless Rome approved. It was like putting a lock on Carthage's hands and then daring them to try anything. And yet, sometimes the harshest part of defeat isn't the political terms, it's the emotional and cultural trauma. The people of Carthage had believed in Hannibal. They had supported his campaign, sacrificed countless resources, and placed their hopes on his genius. And now, seeing him defeated in Africa, right outside their city, broke something deep within them. But what about Hannibal himself, Hannibal, the legend who refused to stop fighting? Even after his defeat, Hannibal didn't curl up and give up. That wasn't who he was. He returned to Carthage and entered politics, trying to rebuild the city's pride and economy from the ground up. He introduced financial reforms, cracked down on corruption, and became a respected leader, almost like a national hero turned statesman. But Rome wasn't comfortable with that. Hannibal's name still carried weight. His presence alone felt like a shadow looming over Rome's hard-won victory. They demanded Carthage surrender him. Hannibal, knowing what Rome would do if he stayed, fled into exile. And you know what he did during exile? He continued advising other kingdoms on military strategy. Essentially, he kept fighting Rome from the sidelines, helping anyone who opposed them. Rome hated it. Hannibal became a wandering legend, a brilliant tactician with no home, moving from kingdom to kingdom, always looking over his shoulder. Eventually, cornered by Roman agents, Hannibal chose to take poison rather than let Rome capture him. His final reported words were something like, "Let us free Rome from the anxiety they have so long experienced." Even at his death, he remained defiant. Rome after victory. The rise of a superpower. Now let's switch to the winners, because Rome didn't just celebrate, they evolved. The Second Punic War forged Rome into something new. A powerful, disciplined, militarized state with a global vision. Before the war, Rome was strong. After the war, Rome was unstoppable. Here's why. Rome now controlled most of the Western Mediterranean. Their military had grown more experienced, battle-hardened, and strategically flexible. They learned to coordinate massive logistics, food, weapons, ships, manpower across continents. Their political system evolved to support long campaigns and complex diplomacy. Rome realized something deep. If you want to dominate the world, you don't just defeat enemies. You reshape the entire world order around yourself. The Roman mindset shifts. Before Hannibal, Rome saw war as defense. After the war, Rome saw war as expansion. Once they understood the power of controlling other regions, they kept going. Macedonia campaigned Syrian war conquest of Greece. Later, expansion into Gaul, Britain, the Middle East. The Second Punic War was the spark that ignited the Roman Empire. Without Hannibal, Rome might have stayed local. With Hannibal, Rome became global. The psychological aftermath. Trauma and confidence together. You would think that a major victory would erase Rome's fear, but no. The ghost of Hannibal haunted Rome for generations. Parents used to warn their kids, "Hannibal is at the gates!" even long after he died. That's the level of respect and fear he commanded. This fear made Rome even more determined to crush Carthage completely. And guess what? It eventually led to the Third Punic War, where Rome destroyed Carthage entirely, burned it to the ground, enslaved survivors, and wiped it off the map. Back then, if Rome felt insecure about you, you weren't going to survive long. The Mediterranean landscape changes forever. After the Second Punic War, everything shifted. Trade routes changed. Economies shifted toward Roman control. Carthage lost influence in North Africa. Rome became the big brother everyone had to listen to. For smaller kingdoms, Spain, Numidia, Greek states, Rome became the center of gravity. You either cooperated with Rome or became a target. The legacy of Hannibal and Scipio. Even today, military academies worldwide still study the Second Punic War. Why? Because it's a masterclass in strategy. Hannibal taught the world how to use terrain as a weapon, how to defeat larger armies using intelligence, how to psychologically attack your enemy. Scipio taught the world how to learn from past defeats, how to fight with flexibility instead of pride, how to strike at the right moment for maximum impact. One used genius, the other used adaptation. Both changed history. Why this war still matters today. If you look at modern geopolitics, power struggles, and global strategy, you'll see shadows of this war everywhere. Preemptive strikes, strategic alliances, economic sanctions, control overseas, psychological warfare, nation building. Rome versus Carthage wasn't just ancient history, it was a blueprint for how major powers behave even now, a human story beneath all the battles. But behind all these huge events, don't forget the human side. Farmers turned into soldiers, families displaced by invading armies, cities burned, cultures merged, clashed, and evolved. Millions of lives were shaped by a war that started because two great nations refused to share power. This is why the Second Punic War isn't just a story about elephants, generals, or battles. It's a story about ambition, fear, pride, resilience, and survival. A story about what people will do, both good and devastating, when they believe their world is on the line. Alright friends, now that we've gone through the major battles, legendary generals, and political struggles, it's time to step away from the big war table and walk into the real world. The world where ordinary people lived, worked, hoped, and suffered, while giants like Hannibal and Scipio were rewriting history. Because here's something many history books forget. Most of the people who lived during the Second Punic War weren't soldiers or senators. They were farmers, traders, craftsmen, mothers, children, enslaved workers, and travelers just trying to survive in a world constantly shaking under the footsteps of massive armies. The war shaped their lives in ways we can barely imagine today. Let's step into their shoes. Rome, during the war, a society under pressure. For the people of Rome, life during Hannibal's invasion was like constantly living with a shadow hanging over your head. Think of the anxiety Americans felt during the Cold War, multiply it by 10, and you get a sense of what Roman civilians were feeling. Every year, news came in. Another Roman army defeated another city, switching allegiance, another region burned, Hannibal moving closer. Rome wasn't used to losing. They weren't used to fear. They were used to control, order, and pride. Hannibal shattered that illusion. Families lost sons, fathers, brothers, not once, but sometimes multiple times. Sons of one generation followed by the sons of the next. And because Rome used citizen soldiers, almost every Roman household had someone fighting. It wasn't like modern professional armies where only a small percentage serve. This war was everyone's war. At one point, Rome was so desperate for manpower that they enlisted. Teenagers, older men well past military age, enslaved people promised freedom, criminals offered forgiveness if they survived. That's how badly Rome was stretched. Women in Rome, holding society together with men constantly marching to the front lines, women had to take over everything back home. Farms, businesses, financial responsibilities, religious rituals, family decision-making. Roman women weren't officially part of politics, but during the war, they became the backbone of the entire Roman economy and community. Imagine a Roman mother watching messenger after messenger arriving in the city square, each carrying news of a battle. Some crowds cheered, some cried. Most just waited, holding their breath, hoping not to hear their family's name among the dead. War changes everyone, and women were no exception. Carthage. During the war, a city torn between hope and fear. While Hannibal was winning battles in Italy, the people of Carthage watched from across the sea with a complicated mix of pride, excitement, and growing worry. For years, victories flowed in. Hannibal seemed unstoppable, but every victory came with a cost. Ships, soldiers, supplies, money. And as the war dragged on, Carthage began feeling the economic pressure. Prices rose, trade slowed. Food shortages hit, especially when Rome targeted Carthaginian merchants and trade partners. And Carthaginian politics were messy. Two factions constantly fought for influence, the war faction, the peace faction. Some leaders supported Hannibal fully, wanting to destroy Rome completely. Others feared Rome's rising power and believed Hannibal had overreached. So while Hannibal was fighting the Romans, the Carthaginian Senate was fighting each other. And that's something we often forget. Behind every great general is a political mess back home. The Italian peninsula, a patchwork of fear and loyalty. Italy during the Second Punic War was like a living chessboard. Cities constantly shifted sides, some supporting Rome, others supporting Hannibal. Hannibal promised freedom and autonomy to many regions suffering under Roman taxes. So some Italian cities welcomed him, others resisted and paid the price. Imagine living in a small village in southern Italy. One month you're under Roman control, the next month Hannibal arrives, and the month after that, Rome comes back again. Armies marching back and forth demanding food, shelter, and loyalty. You didn't get to stay neutral, everyone had to choose. And every choice could get you killed depending on who arrived next. This wasn't just a military war, it was a social earthquake. It was the life for soldiers, hardship, fear, brotherhood. Movies often glamorize ancient warfare, but the reality was brutal. Roman and Carthaginian soldiers marched hundreds of miles, slept on the ground, often starved, and fought in bloody close combat with swords, spears, shields, and their bare hands. For soldiers, war meant disease, hunger, parasites, injuries that never healed, being away from home for years, watching friends die, constant fear. Yet it also meant brotherhood, shared purpose, honor, pride, a sense of identity. Most soldiers were farmers conscripted into service. They didn't know strategy or politics, they only knew survival. Imagine being a Roman soldier who survived Cannae. You watched 50,000 of your comrades fall in a single day. You walked through a field carpeted with bodies. Those memories never left you. Ancient historians wrote about soldiers waking up screaming from nightmares for years afterward. War leaves scars that don't fade. Life for enslaved people, the silent victims. Both Rome and Carthage relied heavily on enslaved labor, and war made things worse. Whenever armies won battles, thousands of captives were taken as slaves. Farmers, craftsmen, prisoners of war, entire families. For enslaved people, war was devastation. They lost everything: home, freedom, identity, future. And the brutal truth is, Rome's economy and expansion depended on this system. Every victory meant more enslaved workers. Every conquest meant new labor forces. It's one of the darker realities of Roman glory. Food, trade, and survival. The Mediterranean economy during the war was shaken. Trade routes disrupted, merchant ships intercepted, grain supplies delayed, prices skyrocketing. Ordinary people struggled to feed their families. Farmers risked invasions. Traders risked piracy. Villagers risked forced recruitment or destruction. Life became a constant gamble. Religion and fear, seeking answers. When the world feels unstable, people turn to belief. Romans prayed to gods like Jupiter, Mars, and Saturn. Carthaginians prayed to Baal-Hamon and Tanit. Every major defeat created waves of religious panic. Sacrifices increased. Rituals intensified. Omens analyzed. Priests consulted. People desperately wanted signs that the gods still supported them. Romans even revived ancient rites they hadn't performed in centuries because they believed neglecting old traditions had angered the gods. That's how deeply fear sank into society. Unculture under pressure. War changed art, storytelling, and identity. Romans told stories of heroism to keep morale up. Carthaginians glorified Hannibal's victories in public squares. Songs, poems, plays all changed tone during the war. Imagine being a kid listening to adults whisper about battles, hearing stories of elephants crossing snowy mountains, watching soldiers march past your house, and trying to understand a world that kept changing every season. The war shaped an entire generation. So what does all this tell us? It tells us that while generals and politicians shaped the map, ordinary people shaped the experience of the war. They felt the losses, they bore the burdens. They lived with the consequences long after the war ended. History isn't just battles. History is people. Their fear, their hope, their struggles, their resilience. And the Second Punic War changed not just nations, but the everyday lives of millions across the ancient world. Hey folks, settle in, because this is where the Second Punic War really becomes the kind of story that makes historians sigh, soldiers sweat, and modern military strategists shake their heads like, yeah, we'd have quit already. Up to this point, Hannibal has crossed Spain, crossed the Pyrenees, lost men, lost horses, lost pack animals, crossed Gaul, been ambushed, bribed tribes, threatened tribes, befriended tribes, nearly frozen to death, and then casually climbed the freaking Alps like he was taking a morning jog. But now, finally, he steps into Italy, and Rome has no idea how much trouble is walking straight toward them. Hannibal arrives in northern Italy, and Rome gets nervous. When Hannibal emerged from the Alps with what was left of his army, the Roman Senate wasn't celebrating, but they also weren't panicking. To Rome, Hannibal showing up in Italy wasn't impossible, it was just annoying. They fully believed they could crush him with 1 or 2 legions, maybe 3 if they were feeling dramatic. Because Rome was thinking like Rome. Hannibal was thinking like a chess grandmaster. The first major encounter wasn't a massive showdown. It was a test. Hannibal checking Rome's reflexes, Rome checking his strength. And the Romans hated what they saw, because Hannibal wasn't just a good general. He wasn't just a smart general, he was dangerously unpredictable. The Battle of Ticinus. Hannibal's first Italian flex. The Romans sent out scouts and cavalry to see what Hannibal had left after his brutal mountain journey. They expected tired men half-trained, Gauls nearly frozen remnants of an army. What they found was fast-moving cavalry, highly disciplined. Numidian horsemen, a commander who already understood how Romans thought. The Roman commander Publius Cornelius Scipio, yes, the father of the future Scipio Africanus, barely escaped alive. His son literally rode into the middle of the battlefield to pull him out. That kid, he'd grow up to end the whole war. But we'll get there later. Point is, Rome just got slapped in the face. Lightly respectfully, but embarrassingly, Hannibal wanted them to know, you're not dealing with amateurs anymore. The Battle of the Trebia. Hannibal shows Rome what a trap looks like. The Romans regrouped. New commander, new confidence, same arrogance. Hannibal used the landscape like a weapon. He hid soldiers in marshy terrain, baited the Romans, and when they charged, they were flanked, surrounded, and crushed. Rome didn't just lose, Rome got humiliated. Thousands of Romans died. Many froze to death trying to cross freezing rivers. And Hannibal, he didn't even lose his cool. He treated Trebia like a warm-up. Rome still didn't understand the problem. This is the part of the story where you want to sit Rome down like a stubborn friend and say, listen, if the guy keeps outsmarting you, stop playing his game. But Rome didn't do that. Rome doubled down. They told themselves Hannibal was just lucky, that his troops were just exotic, that Romans were naturally superior, and this would be over soon. But Hannibal wasn't trying to win a couple battles. He was trying to psychologically break Rome's spirit. And the next phase of his plan, that was the real threat. The Gauls joined Hannibal. Northern Italy was filled with Celtic tribes. Tribes Rome had bullied, taxed, pushed around, or fought for decades. They weren't loyal to Rome. They were terrified of Rome. But Hannibal treated them like equals. He respected their leaders. He paid them. He didn't try to Romanize them. So when Hannibal arrived, guess what happened? Thousands of Gauls joined him. They didn't just join, they celebrated. To them, Hannibal wasn't a foreign general. He was the guy brave enough to punch Rome in the nose. And now Hannibal suddenly had fresh troops, local knowledge, a massive morale boost, a psychological advantage. Rome had no idea how bad this was going to get. Hannibal's march south, turning Italy into a chessboard. Hannibal didn't sit still. He struck fast, moved faster, and used every mistake Rome made as fuel. He was training Italy to panic. Every time Rome sent a legion, Hannibal outmaneuvered it. Every time they set up defenses, Hannibal walked around them like they were traffic cones. He wasn't just fighting battles. He was shaping the entire political climate of the peninsula. City-states watched quietly. Some grew restless. Others sent spies. Many began considering switching sides. Because Rome looked powerful, but Hannibal looked unstoppable. The Battle of Lake Trasimene. One of the greatest ambushes in ancient history. Imagine a lake, heavy fog, a quiet morning. Rome's army is marching single file along a narrow path between water and hills. They think Hannibal is somewhere ahead. They are wrong. Hannibal's army is above them, completely hidden. Tens of thousands of soldiers waiting silently. No movement, no sound, just stillness. And then, as Romans march deeper into the trap, Hannibal gives the signal. The hillsides erupt. Carthaginian troops pour down like a tidal wave. The Romans don't even have space to form proper battle lines. It's chaos, panic, slaughter. It is said that the fog was so thick that soldiers only realized they were dying when the blade touched them. Commanders couldn't see their own men. Horsemen crashed into water trying to escape Rome, lost thousands. The lake reportedly turned red, and Hannibal, he timed it so perfectly that many modern generals still study it today. This wasn't luck. This was mastery. Rome starts to panic. The dictator returns. Rome finally broke. Not militarily, psychologically. They appointed Fabius Maximus as dictator, a temporary emergency title. Fabius was cautious, smart, and painfully slow. Instead of fighting Hannibal, he avoided him, cut off his supplies, harassed him, starved him. Hannibal hated it. His men hated it, but worst of all, Rome hated it. Romans believed in boldness, not patience. They wanted heroic battles, not hide and wait. They started calling Fabius the Delayer, not as a compliment. Politicians mocked him. People complained he was cowardly. Rome wanted a big win. And Hannibal knew exactly how to take advantage of that pride. Rome makes its worst decision. And Hannibal smiles. Rome replaced Fabius with 2 new consuls, both aggressive, ambitious, competitive. They wanted a decisive battle. They wanted glory. They wanted Hannibal destroyed in one sweep. Hannibal, of course, knew that. He was counting on it. He led them to a place called Cannae, a flat, open field, perfect for Rome's massive infantry, terrible for ambushes, or so Rome thought. But Hannibal wasn't planning to ambush. He was planning something far, far worse. Prelude to Cannae. Hannibal's darkest masterpiece. This part of history is so unbelievable that even military experts say this should not have worked, but it did. Hannibal positioned his army in a way that looked weak. He wanted Rome to attack the center. He wanted them to push hard. He wanted them to feel victory. because as they pushed, as they tightened, as they pressed Hannibal's troops inward, they didn't realize they were walking into a closing fist. Two sides of Hannibal's forces slowly moved forward, like curtains closing, like jaws tightening, like the world getting smaller around the Roman legions. Cannae was coming, and it would become one of the most devastating defeats Rome had ever suffered. All right, folks, take a deep breath, because this is the moment that changed the entire trajectory of the Second Punic War. The Battle of Cannae isn't just a highlight in Hannibal's career. It's the kind of event historians still discuss with a weird mix of fear and admiration. If battles were movies, Cannae would be the kind of film where you finish watching and just sit there in silence, thinking, What did I just witness? Let's dive in. After Trebia and Trasimene, Rome was done playing games. They wanted Hannibal crushed so hard that people would be telling the story for centuries as a warning not to mess with Rome. So, they assembled the largest army they had ever put on a battlefield up to that point. Around 80,000 infantry, over 6,000 cavalry, dozens of elite officers, 2 consuls commanding together, reinforcements from allies who absolutely did not want Hannibal knocking at their city gates. Rome thought, there is no universe where Hannibal can beat this. But Hannibal wasn't thinking in terms of size. He was thinking in terms of strategy. When the Roman army took formation at Cannae, they looked unstoppable. A human wall of shields, spears, muscle, and discipline. Hannibal saw something else. A predictable enemy. Rome's biggest strength. Their dense, powerful infantry block was also their weakness. So, Hannibal shaped the battlefield like a trap. His deployment was strange by Roman standards. Almost suspiciously strange. He placed his weakest troops in the center, Gauls and Iberians. He curved the line slightly outward like a shallow bowl. His strongest troops, African infantry, waited quietly on the wings. His cavalry, especially the Numidians, prepared to outmaneuver the Roman horsemen. To Romans, the center looked like the perfect target. It looked like Hannibal was begging them to attack. That's exactly what he wanted. The Roman infantry surged forward like a tidal wave. Imagine tens of thousands of Roman soldiers pushing relentlessly into Hannibal's center, shields slamming, spears piercing, the ground shaking, a roar echoing across the battlefield, and Hannibal's center, slowly, steadily, began to fall back. It looked like panic. It looked like weakness. It looked like Hannibal was losing. But this retreat wasn't chaos, it was choreography. Hannibal personally rode into the center, encouraging men, steadying the line, retreating with them inch by inch. And as the Romans pushed deeper and deeper and deeper, the bowl-shaped line became a pocket. The Romans didn't notice. They were too focused on crushing the center. Once Rome was fully committed, once they were packed tightly like sardines, Hannibal gave a signal. His African infantry on both wings stepped forward, not running, not charging wildly, just closing in like jaws from both sides. The Romans looked up and realized they weren't pushing Hannibal back. They were walking into a shrinking circle. By the time they understood what was happening, it was too late. The Romans were surrounded, completely surrounded. Military textbooks still teach this moment. It's like watching a master painter finish the final stroke on a canvas. Except the canvas was a real battlefield and the ink was real blood. What Hannibal achieved, his weaker center bent without breaking. His flanks pushed inward at the perfect moment. His cavalry swept behind the Romans to cut off their escape. The Roman cavalry was utterly destroyed. The Roman infantry was trapped in a suffocating circle. Rome had walked right into the jaws of the beast. Once the Romans were trapped, the battle stopped being a clash. It became a massacre. Imagine thousands of soldiers packed so tightly they could hardly lift their arms. Men suffocating, crushed by the weight of bodies. Others so pressed together they couldn't even swing swords properly. Hannibal's troops stabbed relentlessly, from the front, from the sides, from behind. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide, no space to breathe. This wasn't a normal defeat, it was annihilation. Historians estimate 50,000, 70,000 Roman soldiers died in a single day. Thousands more were captured. Entire Roman units simply ceased to exist. Consul Lucius Aemilius Paulus died fighting to the end. Many Roman officers were cut down where they stood. To put that in perspective, more people died at Cannae in a few hours than in some entire wars. This was the worst military disaster in Roman history. Maybe the worst defeat suffered by any ancient army ever. News reached Rome slowly at first, then faster, then all at once. When they realized what had happened, the city froze. Business stopped, shops closed. Families cried in the streets. People begged the gods for mercy. Mass funerals overwhelmed the city. Rome declared a national day of mourning, not for a person, but for the Republic itself. Because for the first time ever, Rome believed it might be defeated. This is the most debated question in ancient history. Why didn't Hannibal march on Rome immediately after Cannae? Some say he had too many wounded. Some say he didn't have equipment for a siege. Some say Rome's walls were too strong. Some say he was waiting for alliances to shift. His cavalry commander Hannibal famously said, "You know how to win a victory, Hannibal, but not how to use it." Harsh, but maybe true. Because while Hannibal rested, Rome rebuilt. Slowly, desperately, but determined. This moment, Hannibal not marching on Rome, created a turning point that shaped the rest of the war. After Cannae, a shockwave spread across the Italian peninsula. Many southern Italian cities said, "We're done with Rome. Hannibal, we're with you." Cities switched sides. Allies revolted. Some opened their gates to Hannibal's army. Rome didn't just lose a battle, it lost credibility. Hannibal now controlled huge parts of Italy without even attacking them. He had broken the illusion that Rome was invincible. Even after losing, tens of thousands of soldiers, major commanders, allies, prestige, morale, Rome still chose not to surrender. They refused peace, they refused negotiations, they refused to admit defeat. They rebuilt their armies using teenagers, slaves, farm workers, anyone who could hold a shield. They changed tactics, they adapted, they stopped giving Hannibal the big battles he wanted. But that's the next part of the story. Alright folks, take a sip of water, stretch your back and settle in. Because after the disaster of Cannae, the Second Punic War enters a whole new phase. If the early years were about Hannibal smashing Rome's pride, then this phase is about Rome learning how to survive, adapt, and slowly turn the tide. This isn't just battle history anymore. This is the story of a nation refusing to die. Aindi, Rome after Cannae, a city on the edge. But imagine waking up in Rome the morning after Cannae. Thousands of families waiting for soldiers who would never return. Black clothing everywhere, funeral pyres burning non-stop, shops closed, temples overflowing with people praying, begging, bargaining with the gods. Any normal nation would have surrendered. Seriously, any normal state in the ancient world would have said, "We're done. Take the land, take the cities, take whatever you want. Just stop the bleeding." But Rome wasn't normal. Rome was stubborn, proud. Dangerously proud sometimes. And from that stubbornness came their greatest weapon, the refusal to give up. Rome's Senate meets and makes a shocking decision. After the initial shock, the Senate gathered. Everyone expected fear. Everyone expected talk of peace. Everyone expected someone to say, "Send envoys to Hannibal. Negotiate, save what we can." Instead, the Senate declared something unbelievable. "We will not negotiate with Hannibal. Not now, not ever." Even the families of the dead didn't get their sons' bodies back. Rome refused to ransom the captured. Refused to pay Hannibal anything. Refused to show weakness. It was risky. It was prideful. It was insane. And yet, it worked. Because Rome's message was clear. You can kill us, you can break us, but we will not kneel. Rome rebuilds its army. From nothing. Here's the crazy part. Rome lost around 20% of its military-aged men in a single day at Cannae. That's a national extinction level loss, but Rome didn't collapse. Instead, they recruited 17-year-olds, older veterans, freed slaves, criminals, offered a chance at redemption, field workers who had never held a sword, former sailors converted into foot soldiers. Anyone who could walk was drafted. People who had never worn armor were suddenly marching in formation. It wasn't glamorous, but Rome didn't need glamour. Rome needed bodies and determination, and they got both. Fabius Maximus's strategy returns, and Hannibal hates it. Remember Fabius, the delayer? The guy Romans once mocked for not facing Hannibal head-on. Suddenly, he didn't look so stupid anymore. The Roman high command realized, hey, when we stop giving Hannibal big battles, we stop losing big battles. So, Rome revived the Fabian strategy. Avoid direct confrontation, cut off supplies, harass small units, burn crops before Hannibal's troops reach them, starve him out slowly. It wasn't heroic, it wasn't flashy, but it worked, And Hannibal, he hated every second of it. Ambitia Kyrtin. Hannibal after Cannae, victory without momentum. After Cannae, Hannibal waited. He waited for Rome's allies to abandon them. He waited for reinforcements from Carthage. He waited for Italian cities to switch sides in massive numbers. Some did, but not enough. He waited for Carthaginian armies to arrive from Spain. They didn't. He waited for Carthage to send siege equipment. They refused. Great timing, right? He waited for Rome to collapse politically. It didn't. It's like Hannibal won the biggest jackpot in military history. And Carthage handed him a gift card with $12 on it. Jaguars, Carthage, the worst support team in history. You'd think that after Hannibal destroyed Rome's largest army ever, Carthage would say, yes, send supplies, send troops, keep pushing. Nope. Carthage argued, politicians delayed. Wealthy families didn't want to spend money. Generals got jealous. Instead of sending help, they sent letters, suggestions, criticism. Hannibal needed 20,000 men, he got 4,000. And they were late. Imagine scoring the winning touchdown, and your coach benches you for using too much energy. That's how Hannibal felt. Hannibal moves through southern Italy. City by city, while Rome rebuilt, Hannibal tried to strengthen his hold on southern Italy. Some cities welcomed him, others hesitated. A few betrayed him. He captured Capua, a major city, huge win. Tarentum, partially. Several key towns along trade routes, Capua was the biggest prize. It was wealthy, strategic, and symbolic. To Hannibal, it was proof that Rome's power was cracking. To Rome, it was a punch in the gut. But Rome didn't fall apart. Instead, they adapted again. Withdrew. Rome besieges its own allies ruthlessly. You want to see Rome's dark side? This is the moment. When Capua defected to Hannibal, Rome took it personally. Very personally. They marched south. They cut off water supplies. They blocked roads. They built siege lines. They starved out their former allies. It was brutal, cold, efficient. The message was clear. If you betray Rome, we will come back for you. And one by one, cities that considered joining Hannibal began to second guess. Hannibal saves cities. But it cost him. Hannibal tried to relieve sieges. He rode to Capua. He tried to distract Roman legions. He tried to force Rome into another big battle. But Rome refused. They ignored him. They starved Capua instead. Hannibal even marched all the way to the gates of Rome, not to conquer it, but to scare Rome into pulling back troops. It didn't work. Rome simply said, cool, enjoy the sightseeing, we're busy. It was maybe the first time in the war that Hannibal's psychological tricks failed. Hannibal's problem. He could win battles, not the war. By this point, Hannibal had won almost every major battle, killed tens of thousands of Romans, captured major allies, controlled parts of southern Italy, but he couldn't break Rome's system. He couldn't force surrender. He couldn't take the city. He couldn't split the Republic in half. Because Rome wasn't held together by fear, it was held together by stubborn unity. And slowly, painfully, that unity started turning into a comeback. New Roman commanders rise. A generation shaped by trauma. The young men who survived Cannae, or whose fathers died at Cannae, were now coming of age. They didn't grow up thinking Rome was invincible. They grew up thinking Rome was bleeding and needed saving. Among them were Claudius Nero, Martellus the Sword of Rome, and most importantly, Publius Cornelius Scipio, the same young man who saved his father at the Battle of Ticinus. Scipio would become the single greatest Roman answer to Hannibal. But he wasn't ready yet. Not quite. Part 10 is where he steps into the spotlight. The war turns into a stalemate. For years, yes, actual years, Hannibal marched across Italy, winning skirmishes, taking towns, fighting legions, outsmarting commanders, but slowly running out of momentum. Rome refused to fight big battles. Rome refused to surrender. Rome refused to break. Hannibal could win tactical victories forever, but without reinforcements, without siege equipment, without political backing, he was slowly being worn down. This wasn't dramatic, it wasn't cinematic, but it was deadly effective. Rome had learned how to fight Hannibal by not fighting him. Alright friends, now that we've seen Hannibal's incredible victories at Trebia, Trasimene and Cannae, it's easy to assume Rome would crumble entirely. But here's the twist. They didn't. Not even close. Think about it for a second. You've just witnessed the destruction of tens of thousands of your countrymen. Families mourning sons who will never return. Cities afraid to even look at the horizon because armies could appear out of nowhere. And yet, Rome doesn't surrender. That's what makes this moment in history so fascinating. Rome's reaction after Cannae wasn't flashy. It wasn't heroic in a single battle sense. It was methodical, deliberate, and stubborn to a fault. And in some ways, this stubbornness would become the foundation for Rome's eventual comeback. The psychological recovery imagined being a Roman citizen at the time. You've just lost your brother, your father, or your neighbor in one of the worst defeats the world had ever seen. The streets are quiet, not because people are safe, but because everyone is afraid to move. Markets are empty. Messages from survivors trickle in slowly, each one worse than the last. And yet life continues. People still wake up, still tend to their farms, still maintain a sense of community. The human mind, even under tremendous pressure, finds a way to function. That's exactly what happened in Rome. The Senate, after initial shock, met repeatedly. There was panic, yes, but also clarity. Rome's leaders realized that continuing to fight conventional battles against Hannibal was suicidal. They couldn't replace their lost men fast enough. They couldn't match the Carthaginian general in tactical brilliance. So they adopted a new approach. Delay, avoid direct engagement, and slowly starve the enemy of opportunity. This strategy, later known as the Fabian strategy, wasn't glamorous. No one won glory on the battlefield. No decisive victory was declared in the Senate chambers, but it played to Rome's greatest strength, endurance. The Fabian strategy in action. Fabius Maximus, often called the Delayer by his critics, suddenly became the most important Roman leader in this period. He didn't charge into battle. He didn't seek to defeat Hannibal in a single, heroic encounter. Instead, he harassed Hannibal's supply lines, avoided major confrontations where Rome could suffer massive casualties, used smaller forces to slow and frustrate the Carthaginian army, forced Hannibal to spread his troops thin, overextending himself. Now imagine being a Roman soldier under this strategy. On one hand, you don't get the glory or the adrenaline of a massive victory. On the other hand, you survive, and surviving in Hannibal's Italy was no small feat. Every life preserved was another brick in the slow reconstruction of Rome's military might. Hannibal, meanwhile, was growing frustrated. He had won victories, yes, but Rome was adapting. They weren't giving him the battles he craved. Rome wasn't broken. Rome was learning. Apis, Rome's army rebuilding. Rome's army after Cannae was like trying to refill a bucket that had a hole in it. The losses were staggering, and yet Rome tapped into its most resilient resource, its people. Teenagers too young to have been in battle were drafted. Older men past their prime were called up. Freed slaves were promised citizenship in exchange for service. Volunteers from allied states filled the ranks. Rome's manpower was nearly limitless. Its willingness to absorb losses and keep fighting was unmatched in the ancient world. That's a mindset we sometimes underestimate when we read about history. This wasn't just brute force, it was an entire society geared toward survival. And that mindset would pay dividends. Slowly, methodically, Rome began to recover. The city rebuilt its defenses, strengthened loyalty among allies, and kept Hannibal from achieving his ultimate goal, breaking the Roman state entirely. Hannibal's limitations. Even the most brilliant generals face constraints. Hannibal had already achieved tactical genius, victories in multiple major battles, a reputation that terrified Italy, and control of southern Italian cities. But he couldn't take Rome itself. Why not? Several factors came into play. 1. Supply lines. Hannibal's army was deep in enemy territory. Feeding and equipping tens of thousands of men over months was a logistical nightmare. Siege equipment. Carthage didn't send Hannibal the heavy siege tools he needed to assault a fortified city like Rome. 3. Allies. While many Italian cities joined him, some stayed loyal to Rome, providing resistance and intelligence. 4. Psychological pressure. Hannibal's victories created fear, yes, but also resilience. Rome wasn't going to negotiate. Surrender was off the table. So, despite battlefield brilliance, Hannibal was trapped by the limitations of distance, resources, and political realities. From this point forward, the Second Punic War shifts. It's no longer just a story of brilliant maneuvers and catastrophic battles. Now it's about endurance. Rome uses attrition to wear down Hannibal's forces. Hannibal tries to keep momentum while waiting for reinforcements that don't arrive. Both sides fight skirmishes. smaller engagements, and campaigns that slowly shape Italy's political landscape. Every day becomes a game of patience, resource management, and calculation. Rome's strategy might not be flashy, but it's effective. Hannibal may be a genius tactician, but even geniuses can't overcome a nation willing to endure decades of hardship. This period also highlights the importance of alliances. Hannibal tried to sway Italy's cities to his side, promising freedom from Roman taxes and governance. Some did switch allegiance, including Capua. But Rome's policy of punishing defectors after the war, combined with the sheer resilience of loyal allies, prevented a total collapse. Rome's allies weren't just silent observers, they were participants. Their loyalty, hesitation, or defection played directly into the strategies of both sides. And over time, Rome learned to strengthen these relationships, creating a foundation for the final stages of the war. Let's take a moment to step inside the minds of Romans living in this era. Imagine constant fear, loss, and uncertainty. Every message could bring news of another fallen legion. Every city could be a target for Hannibal's army. Every family could lose sons in battle. And yet Rome adapts. The Senate manages to maintain order. Soldiers endure grueling campaigns. Citizens continue daily life despite the backdrop of war. This endurance, this psychological resilience, is as crucial as any army, general, or tactic. By the end of this stage, we start to see the seeds of Rome's eventual comeback. A rebuilt and disciplined army, strengthened political structures, strategic patience and adaptability, and new leadership emerging among young Romans. And somewhere across the Mediterranean, a young Scipio begins to rise, learning from Hannibal's brilliance and mistakes, preparing for the moment when he will challenge the Carthaginian general directly. If you thought Rome was just going to sit back and let Hannibal roam free in Italy forever, think again. While Hannibal was consolidating victories in southern Italy, Rome wasn't idly waiting. They were learning, adapting, and preparing a counterpunch. And at the center of that counterpunch would eventually rise one of Rome's most brilliant generals, Publius Cornelius Scipio. Now, think about it from the Roman perspective. The losses at Cannae still haunted the city, but they couldn't afford despair. Every decision, every deployment, every recruitment mattered. Rome had learned that brute force alone wasn't enough. They needed strategy, leadership, and timing. And that's exactly what Scipio would bring. Scipio, the young commander. Publius Cornelius Scipio wasn't an old grizzled veteran. No, he was in his 20s, sharp and ambitious. More importantly, he had seen the consequences of Hannibal's brilliance firsthand. He had been there at Ticinus, helping save his father, watching Hannibal's tactics unfold like a masterclass in psychological warfare. This experience shaped him. While Rome's older generals sometimes relied on caution or tradition, Scipio had a different mindset. He understood Hannibal not as an unbeatable force, but as a human commander with weaknesses. He observed Hannibal's successes and studied his methods, thinking, "Aicamnon und digi. If he can be this brilliant in Italy, maybe there's a way to challenge him where he least expects it." And where Hannibal least expected it was Spain. Rome targets. Spain. Hannibal had crossed the Alps, dominated northern Italy, and terrorized the Roman legions. But he had left his supply lines in Spain vulnerable, and that's exactly where Rome would strike. The Roman Senate appointed Scipio to command a new expedition to Spain. His mission was clear. 1. Cut off Hannibal's reinforcements from Carthage. 2. Secure loyal allies in the Iberian Peninsula. 3. Prevent Carthage from sending fresh troops into Italy. For Scipio, it wasn't just a mission, it was a chance to redeem Rome's honor, to take the fight to the enemy, and to demonstrate that Rome could learn from its defeats. Challenges in Spain wasn't easy. The terrain was rugged, the tribes were unpredictable, and the Carthaginian forces there were experienced and entrenched. Hannibal had left a capable subordinate, Hasdrubal, in charge, someone who knew the land and the Roman threat intimately. Scipio faced several immediate challenges: recruiting and training new legions in a foreign land, building alliances with cities that had wavered between Rome and Carthage, navigating unfamiliar terrain while avoiding ambushes, confronting a commander who had been trained by Hannibal's own strategies. Every decision could mean victory or disaster. Ikami? Scipio's early campaigns. The young Roman commander wasted no time. He started by securing key ports and towns, ensuring safe supply lines, and winning the trust of local tribes. Scipio knew that diplomacy was as important as military skill. Cities that had once flirted with Carthage began to see Rome as the stronger, more dependable partner. Then, strategically, Scipio engaged Hasdrubal's forces in a series of skirmishes. Not all were decisive victories, but each encounter provided critical intelligence. He learned about the Carthaginian formations, the use of elephants, and the morale of their troops. The lesson here is subtle but important. Rome wasn't just fighting battles, it was learning the art of Hannibal's own warfare and adapting it to their advantage. The Battle of Baecula, Scipio's first major success in Spain, came at Baecula. It wasn't a massive cinematic battlefield clash like Cannae, but it was strategic brilliance in action. He divided his forces, using diversionary tactics to lure Hasdrubal into a vulnerable position. His infantry and cavalry coordinated attacks precisely, demonstrating a level of discipline and training that hadn't been possible in the years immediately after Cannae. Scipio's forces forced Hasdrubal to retreat, though the Carthaginian commander escaped with a significant portion of his army. The victory at Baecula proved two things. One, Scipio could command independently and think strategically. Hannibal's supply lines and reinforcements could be disrupted, weakening his position in Italy indirectly. And to Azerbaijan, psychological warfare and leadership. Scipio's brilliance wasn't just tactical, it was psychological. He understood that morale mattered as much as numbers. His troops were inspired by his confidence, his decisiveness, and his willingness to learn from past Roman mistakes. Meanwhile, the Carthaginians began to feel pressure. The same fear Hannibal had instilled in Italy was now mirrored back on Carthage's own generals. Hannibal had powerful troops in Italy, but without reinforcements from Spain, his ability to sustain the campaign was slowly dwindling. Scipio's campaigns in Spain began to create a ripple effect, weakening Hannibal's long-term prospects while setting Rome up for the eventual counterattack. Rome's strategic shift. At this point, Rome's strategy was evolving on multiple fronts. 1. Avoiding large-scale engagements in Italy. Rome didn't want another Cannae. 2. Strengthening alliances and morale. Cities that had defected now reconsidered their loyalty. 3. Cutting off Hannibal from reinforcements. Scipio in Spain ensured the enemy couldn't receive fresh troops easily. 4. Developing new leaders. Young commanders like Scipio were gaining experience, preparing for future decisive battles. The combination of patience, attrition, and smart leadership was slowly turning the tide. Hannibal had brilliant tactics, but Rome had resilience, and now strategic brilliance of their own emerging. Alright friends, by now you've probably realized something important about this whole war. Rome wasn't winning because they were the strongest at the beginning. They were winning because they refused to stay weak. And nowhere is that clearer than in the story of Scipio's deepening campaigns in Spain. Hannibal had invaded Italy hoping his victories would shake Rome to its core, make allies defect, and eventually collapse the Republic. But what he didn't expect was Rome striking back with someone just as clever, just as charismatic, and just as relentless as himself. Scipio wasn't just following orders anymore, he was shaping the direction of the war. Before we get into the battles, here's something that says more about Scipio's character than anything else. He studied Hannibal, not in a copy your opponent way, but in a deeper, almost psychological way. Scipio understood that Hannibal's real power wasn't just elephants or cavalry or quick ambushes, it was his ability to read people, to sense panic, to predict the exact moment when his enemy would break. And Scipio began applying that same awareness in Spain. He didn't approach tribes as just numbers on a map. He talked to their leaders. He gave them respect Rome hadn't always shown. He listened, negotiated, and built trust. Many tribes who had once fought alongside Carthage now saw Rome differently, not as conquerors, but as a rising power worth aligning with. This diplomatic approach would become one of Scipio's greatest strengths. Let's be clear, Spain during this period wasn't a unified nation. It was a mosaic of tribes, kingdoms, fortified towns, and shifting allegiances. Some supported Carthage because Carthage treated them as partners. Some supported Rome because Rome offered stability and protection. Some didn't support anyone. They just wanted to survive. So Scipio had to become more than a general. He had to be a strategist, a negotiator, almost a statesman. And every alliance he secured chipped away at Hannibal's foundation. If you remember just one thing from Scipio's campaigns in Spain, let it be this. The capture of New Carthage was a turning point. New Carthage was Carthage's most important stronghold in Spain, rich, well defended, and sitting on a natural harbor. It was the center of their supply system, a hub for reinforcements, and a symbol of Carthaginian power. and Scipio captured it with a level of precision that would later define his entire career. Here's how it happened. He marched his forces quickly, covering ground faster than expected. He used detailed intelligence about the city's geography, and, in one of the smartest tactical moves of the entire war, he exploited the low tide to approach the city through the lagoon, a path the defenders thought impossible. Imagine being a Carthaginian soldier watching the tide recede and seeing Roman troops walking where water had been just hours earlier. That wasn't just a surprise attack, that was psychological warfare. With New Carthage captured, Rome gained a critical naval base, stores of weapons and supplies, hostages who later became bargaining tools, tremendous morale among their own troops. And most importantly, Hannibal's reinforcements from Spain were now severely crippled. Victories don't just change maps, they change people. Scipio's men began believing they were fighting under someone who truly understood leadership, someone who wasn't reacting to Carthage. He was forcing Carthage to react to him. Back in Rome, news of the victory spread like wildfire. After years of despair following Cannae, this was hope. Real, tangible hope. People whispered Scipio's name with pride. The Senate saw him as a rising star. And Hannibal's allies in Spain? Many started reconsidering their position. Nothing shakes political loyalty like a string of unexpected victories. Of course, Carthage wasn't going to give up Spain without a fight. Hasdrubal tried regrouping. Syphax, a North African ally of Carthage, offered support. Carthaginian commanders attempted to unify their armies, but Scipio moved faster. He used Rome's growing naval presence to pressure coastal cities. He conducted lightning marches that caught Carthage off guard. And he avoided unnecessary battles, not because he was afraid, but because he understood that time itself was now a weapon. The longer Scipio held Spain, the weaker Hannibal became in Italy. Building the foundation for something bigger. By holding Spain, Scipio wasn't just winning battles, he was setting up Rome's future moves. 1. He was cutting off Hannibal's reinforcements. No army survives long without replacements. He was building his own experienced, loyal legions. These soldiers would one day follow him into the most important battle of the entire war. 3. He was building trust among Spain's tribes. Rome would eventually integrate these territories, gaining manpower and resources for generations. 4. He was proving to the Senate that bold strategy could work. Rome didn't need to play safe forever, they could take calculated risks. Every move Scipio made was shaping the next phase of the war, even if people didn't yet realize it. The human side of war. Let's take a moment and step back. Imagine being one of Scipio's soldiers. You're far from home, in a land with unfamiliar languages, unfamiliar foods, unfamiliar customs. You're fighting against seasoned Carthaginian troops, dealing with long marches, heat, diseases, and uncertainty. But you're also part of something bigger. You're following a commander who talks to you like you matter. Who explains his plans instead of hiding them? Who leads from the front? That kind of leadership changes how people fight. It changes how armies grow. And it changes how wars end. Spain shifts toward Rome. By the end of Scipio's intensified campaigns, major strongholds fell to Rome. Carthage was losing territory faster than they could defend it. Hannibal's link to Spain was growing weaker. Roman confidence was rising. Carthaginian commanders were forced to retreat. It was becoming clear Spain was no longer a safe haven for Carthage. It was becoming the launch platform for Rome's next bold move. A move that would eventually take this war straight to the gates of Carthage itself. Alright friends, now that we've crossed deep into the heart of Rome's darkest years when every sunrise felt like a question mark, and every sunset felt like borrowed time, it's time to explore one of the most quietly terrifying phases of the Second Punic War, the years when Hannibal, though undefeated on the battlefield, began to lose the war. Slowly, silently, like sand slipping through clenched fingers. Because wars aren't only won by swords and generals. They're also won by supply lines, food shortages, lonely allies, fading morale, political pressure, and the invisible weight of time itself. And here, tonight, we enter that part of the story. Settle in, Hannibal's problem, the victor who couldn't win. For nearly 15 years, Hannibal had been the ghost Rome couldn't exorcise. He had beaten them at Trebia, he had destroyed them at Lake Trasimene, he had annihilated them at Cannae, and yet He never took Rome itself. This fact confused ancient historians and still confuses people today. But the truth is chillingly simple. He couldn't. Not because he lacked genius, but because he lacked everything else. Imagine this. You are deep inside enemy territory with no supply line, no reinforcement cities that support you only if they feel like it, armies that must be fed by whatever the land gives, and a Roman state refusing to die no matter how hard you hit it. Hannibal stood undefeated, but he was also stranded inside the largest and strongest republic in the world. Rome learned something from their disasters. They didn't have to defeat Hannibal, they just had to starve him of success. So they switched strategies. No more giant battles. No more heroic charges. No more trying to outsmart a man who had built his entire career on outsmarting people. Instead, they shadowed him, hemmed him in, bled his allies away, and rebuilt their armies again and again like a machine that refused to break. Rome's message was clear. You may defeat us 100 times, but unless you defeat our system, our politics, our citizens, and our economy, you cannot defeat Rome. This was the beginning of Hannibal's slow, quiet downfall. Rome slowly tightens the noose. Let's shift our attention to the Roman Senate. A room full of old men, expensive robes, endless arguments, and yet an almost frightening ability to adapt under pressure. After Cannae, the Senate didn't collapse. They doubled down. They raised new armies, even using slaves if they had to. They fortified the city. They convinced wavering Italian cities to stay loyal by offering protection, money, or political favors. Rome was like a wounded lion, bleeding. Yes, weakened, definitely, threatened, absolutely, but defeated, not a chance. And because they now refused to meet Hannibal in open battle, he could no longer crush armies for political leverage. Instead, he wandered Italy like a storm cloud nobody was afraid of anymore. A storm that thunders but does not strike. And this terrified Hannibal more than any Roman legion. Loyalties break, the slow collapse of Carthage's support system. This is where things get even more human, more political, more tragic. Because while Hannibal was fighting Rome, he was also fighting his own country, Carthage, a city filled with merchants who preferred profits over war, a government run by aristocrats who resented Hannibal's family, a ruling council that believed supporting Hannibal too much would give him too much power. So instead of supplying him like Rome supplied its generals, Carthage did the opposite. They argued, they delayed, they sent half-hearted reinforcements. They underfunded the war they themselves had approved. Imagine using a smartphone with 5% battery while fighting someone with a full charging station. That was Hannibal, and every year the battery dropped lower. The Roman comeback. Scipio arrives. Now let's shift scenes. Far away from Hannibal, across the sea, a young Roman commander begins rising like a sunrise. Publius Cornelius Scipio, later known as Scipio Africanus. He had survived the disaster at Cannae, one of the few young officers who walked out alive. He had seen Rome at its lowest. He had sworn to restore it. And unlike the older Roman generals, Scipio didn't fear Hannibal. He admired him. He studied his tactics. He adopted his flexibility. He learned to move fast, strike unexpectedly, and use psychology as a weapon. In a way, Scipio became the Roman version of Hannibal, and this is the moment the balance shifted. Scipio went to Spain, the territory Hannibal's brothers were defending. In just a few years, he destroyed Carthage's entire power base there. He captured supply depots, wealth, silver mines, and allied tribes that Hannibal desperately needed. This was like cutting off a man's legs before the final battle. And when Spain fell, Scipio had one more idea. A risky, brilliant, terrifying idea. If Hannibal won't leave Italy, we will force him to. How? By taking the war to his doorstep. Straight to Carthage. Rome invades North Africa, and panic begins. Picture Carthage now. Peaceful streets, merchants counting money, ships carrying luxury goods, and then suddenly, Roman sails appear on the coastline, panic floods the city, and the Carthaginian council immediately realizes something horrifying. They need Hannibal. Right now, the same generals they ignored, the same commander they underfunded, the same warrior they left stranded in Italy, they now begged him to come home and save them. So Hannibal, after almost 16 years in Italy, finally turns around. He boards ships. He leaves behind the land where he had won his greatest victories. He returns to the homeland that never truly supported him, and waiting for him in Africa is Scipio. Not scared, not hesitant, but ready Hannibal, now older, weary, and without the unstoppable army he once had, prepares for the fight of his life. This is where destiny tightens. This is where two of the greatest generals in history finally step into the same spotlight, and the entire ancient world holds its breath. The night before the final battle. Let's slow down, because this moment is too important to rush. Imagine the night sky over North Africa, dark, quiet, with a cold breeze sweeping across the plains. Two camps, two armies, two legends. Hannibal sits alone, looking at the ashes of what could have been. Maybe he thinks of his march across the Alps. Maybe he thinks of the friends he lost. Maybe he thinks of all the chances he had to win. And Scipio? He is calm, focused. He believes this is his moment. That tomorrow he will do what no Roman before him has ever done. Defeat the myth. Defeat the monster Rome grew up fearing. Defeat Hannibal Barca. And with sunrise, the Battle of Zama begins. Alright friends, this is it. This is the moment the entire Second Punic War has been slowly, painfully, inevitably moving toward. No more detours, no more delays, no more games of patience and attrition. Two men, two armies, two completely different visions of how the world should work. And one battlefield in North Africa. Welcome to Zama. The weight of history on one morning. Imagine waking up that morning, the sun rising over the African plains, cutting through the mist. The air heavy, not just with heat, but with something harder to describe. Expectation, fear. History pressing down on every breath. On one side stands Hannibal Barca, older now, scarred by years of campaigning, still brilliant but no longer unstoppable. This isn't the Hannibal of the Alps or Cannae. This Hannibal is fighting with a mixed army of veterans and inexperienced recruits, war elephants that aren't as well trained as before allies, whose loyalty depends entirely on the outcome of this one battle, and most painfully of all, he is fighting on defense, not offense. For the first time in his life, Hannibal is not choosing the battlefield. He is responding to someone else's move. And that someone is Scipio. Scipio's mindset: calm, controlled, ready. Now shift your focus. Across the field, Scipio stands with his officers. Younger than Hannibal, yes, but battle-tested, confident, and absolutely clear-headed. Scipio has spent years preparing for this moment. He has studied Hannibal's tactics like a scholar studies a text. He has adapted Roman formations to counter Carthaginian strength. He has trained his men not to fear elephants, cavalry, or sudden chaos. Most importantly, he believes Rome belongs here. Not because of destiny, not because of pride, but because Rome learned from its failures. That belief, quiet, grounded, unshakable, radiates through his army. The armies face each other. Let's break down what each side is bringing into this fight. Hannibal's army, roughly 40,000 infantry, around 80 war elephants. Cavalry made up of mixed Carthaginian and Numidian units. Veterans from Italy mixed with newly recruited soldiers. This army has experience, but not unity. Scipio's army, highly disciplined Roman legions. Strong cavalry support, including Numidian allies led by Massinissa soldiers trained specifically to counter elephants. A command structure that trusts Scipio completely. This army has cohesion, and cohesion wins wars. The elephants move. First, Hannibal opens the battle the way Carthage traditionally does. He sends the elephants forward. Now pause here because this moment matters. In earlier battles, elephants caused panic. Horses bolted infantry broke formation. Chaos followed, but not today. Scipio had prepared for this exact moment. Instead of tight traditional formations, the Roman legions open corridors, wide lanes straight through their ranks. As the elephants charge, Roman soldiers blow horns, shout, throw javelins, strike at sensitive points. Some elephants panic and turn back, trampling Hannibal's own lines. Others charge straight through the Roman lanes, doing almost no damage. This is the first psychological blow of the battle. Hannibal realizes something immediately. Scipio has neutralized one of his greatest weapons, and the fight has barely begun. Infantry collision. Discipline versus desperation. Next comes the infantry. Lines crash together. Shields slam, blades clash, dust fills the air. But there's a difference in how these two armies fight. Hannibal's front lines, newer troops, fight hard, but without the cohesion of veterans. When pressure mounts, they begin to pull back. Behind them stand Hannibal's Italian veterans, the men who crossed the Alps with him, who survived Trebia, Trasimene, and Cannae. But here's the problem. Those veterans don't immediately move forward. There's confusion, space collapses. Orders don't travel cleanly through the lines. For the first time in his career, Hannibal's army doesn't move like a single organism. Rome's does. Scipio rotates fresh units forward, pulls tired ones back, maintains structure even under pressure. This isn't flashy, it's efficient. Now quietly, almost unnoticed at first, the cavalry disappears from the battlefield. Roman and Carthaginian cavalry clash, then vanish beyond the dust and horizon. Minutes pass, then more, and suddenly, they return, but only one side comes back. Scipio's cavalry, led by Massinissa, charges into the rear of Hannibal's infantry. This is the moment. The exact nightmare Hannibal once inflicted on Rome at Cannae is now happening to him. Surrounded, pressed from the front, hit from behind, the battlefield collapses into chaos. Hannibal fights on, his veterans fight on. But brilliance cannot overcome geometry, and geometry is against him. When the dust settles, the truth is unavoidable. Hannibal has lost, not because he forgot how to fight, not because he became weak, but because Rome finally produced someone who could match him, and a system that supported that man completely. Scipio stands victorious. Hannibal withdraws. The Second Punic War is, for all practical purposes, over. Carthage sues for peace, and the terms are brutal. Massive war indemnities, loss of overseas territories, a stripped-down military, no wars without Roman permission. Carthage survives, but as a shadow. Hannibal lives, but as a defeated legend. Rome emerges not just victorious, but transformed. No longer just a regional power. Now, a Mediterranean superpower. Hannibal would spend the rest of his life running, advising foreign kings, evading Roman assassins, watching the world shift under Roman control. And when Rome finally closes in, he takes his own life. A man who terrified an empire dies quietly, far from any battlefield. History remembers him not as a loser, but as one of the greatest military minds who ever lived. The Second Punic War didn't just decide Rome vs. Carthage. It decided how empires survive disaster, why adaptability beats brilliance alone, how systems outlast individuals, and how patience can defeat genius. This war shaped the future of Europe, North Africa, and the Mediterranean for centuries, and its echoes still live in how modern nations think about power, endurance, and survival. Alright friends, the fighting is over. No marching armies, no elephants, no dust-filled battlefields, just silence. And in that silence, something far more powerful than any army begins to take shape: the future. Because the Second Punic War didn't end when Hannibal lost at Zama. It ended when the world quietly accepted a new reality. Rome wasn't just alive anymore. Rome was inevitable. Let's start where the pain was deepest. Carthage survived, but barely. The peace treaty Rome imposed wasn't designed to heal. It was designed to neutralize. Carthage had to pay massive war reparations every year, hand over its fleet, keeping only a few ships, surrender Spain and all overseas territories, and promise never to wage war without Rome's approval. Imagine a once proud city reduced to asking permission to defend itself. That wasn't peace, that was containment. And Rome watched carefully, making sure Carthage would never again rise as a military threat. Hannibal didn't disappear after Zama. He became something far more unsettling. A living reminder of what Rome had almost lost. Back in Carthage, Hannibal tried to reform the government, cut corruption, fix finances, strengthen the state from within. And ironically, he was good at it. Too good, Rome noticed. They always did, so Hannibal fled. From Carthage to Tyre, from Tyre to the Seleucid court. From kingdom to kingdom, advising rulers who dreamed of resisting Rome. But everywhere he went, Rome followed. Not with armies, with pressure. Eventually, cornered and surrounded, Hannibal chose his ending. He swallowed poison. No battlefield. No glory, no final charge. Just a quiet death for a man who once shook the ancient world to its core. And in that moment, Rome didn't just defeat a man. They outlived him. Rome emerged victorious, but not unchanged. This war hardened Rome in ways no previous conflict ever had. They learned how to lose catastrophically and recover, how to fight smarter instead of harder, how to wage long wars without breaking politically, and how to produce leaders through experience, not luck. Rome learned patience, and patience would become their most dangerous weapon. After the Second Punic War, Rome stopped reacting to threats. They started preventing them. Before this war, Rome thought defensively. After this war, Rome thought strategically. They didn't ask, who threatens us today? They asked, Who might threaten us tomorrow? Spain became Roman, North Africa came under Roman influence. The Mediterranean slowly turned into a Roman lake. The Second Punic War taught Rome a brutal truth: if you don't control the edges of your world, someone else will. And Rome never forgot that lesson. Scipio Africanus returned to Rome a hero. But even heroes in Rome had limits. He was celebrated, admired, then quietly sidelined, because Rome feared powerful individuals almost as much as it feared enemies. Scipio retired early, disillusioned, watching the Republic slowly drift toward the very imperial system his victories made possible. History is cruel like that. The man who saved Rome helped create the conditions that would eventually consume it. Here's why the Second Punic War still matters, right now in the modern world. This war teaches us that raw genius alone doesn't win long conflicts. Systems beat individuals over time. Adaptability is more important than tradition. Endurance can be more powerful than brilliance. And political unity matters as much as military strength. Rome didn't win because they were smarter from the start. They won because they learned faster than their enemy could adapt. And that lesson echoes through modern geopolitics, military strategy, and even corporate power struggles today. Alright friends, on paper, the Second Punic War is over. Treaties have been signed. Armies have stopped marching. The names of generals are already being written into history. But here's the truth: most history books rush past. Wars don't really end when the fighting stops. They end much later inside people's lives. And that's where we are now. Picture Rome in the years immediately after Zama. The city is standing, the Republic survives. The enemy is defeated, but walk through the streets and you can feel it. Something has shifted. Entire neighborhoods are missing young men. Fields outside the city lie half-worked. Some houses are permanently quiet. Rome didn't just lose soldiers in this war, it lost a generation. Tens of thousands of citizens never came home. Not from one battle, but from years of constant fighting. Victory came at a cost so high that most Romans didn't even know how to talk about it. Many soldiers did return, but they didn't return the same. These men had lived for years with the expectation of sudden death. They had watched friends disappear in moments. They had survived ambushes, starvation, disease, and fear that never truly shut off. At night, sleep didn't come easily. Loud noises triggered instinct, not thought. Crowds felt dangerous. The Romans didn't have a word for trauma. They didn't understand psychological wounds. They honored these men with praise and ceremony, but they didn't know how to help them live normal lives again. So many veterans simply drifted. Rome won the war, but the victory reshaped its economy in ways that would haunt it. Before the Second Punic War, Rome was a republic of small landowners. Citizens fought, returned home, and worked their farms. But this war lasted too long. Many farmers were gone for years. While they were away, debts piled up. Land was sold, property changed hands. When veterans returned, they often found their farms gone. The result? Wealth concentrated in fewer hands. Large estates replaced small farms. Displaced citizens flooded into cities. This wasn't collapse, but it was imbalance. And imbalance is dangerous in a republic. There's another side to Roman victory that rarely gets softened. Rome captured people, a lot of people, from Spain, from Africa, from Italy itself. These captives became slaves. They worked fields, they dug mines. They built wealth for others. Slavery already existed in Rome, but after this war, it expanded massively. And with cheap slave labor everywhere, free citizens struggled to compete. Rome's economy became stronger, but its social fabric became weaker. This tension wouldn't explode immediately, but it never went away. The war also changed how Rome thought about power. Let's end with the strangest truth of all. Hannibal is remembered more vividly than most Roman generals. His tactics are still studied. His name still carries weight. His march across the Alps still feels impossible. Rome won the war, but Hannibal won immortality. And maybe that's the final twist of the Second Punic War. So tonight, as you sit back, maybe with the lights low and the world quiet, remember this: empires don't rise in moments of victory. They rise in moments of survival. Rome survived Hannibal, and in doing so, they changed the course of history forever. This is where history stops being a list of events and starts becoming a question. Because for all of Rome's confidence after Zama, there's an uncomfortable truth we don't like to sit with long enough. Rome almost lost everything. Not once, not twice, but over and over again. And tonight, we're going to explore the world that almost existed. The one where Hannibal didn't just survive in Italy, but actually won. The moment Rome nearly broke. Let's rewind, not all the way to the Alps, not even to Trebia or Lake Trasimene. Let's go back to Cannae, picture it again. A Roman army so large it believed numbers alone guaranteed victory, commanders confident enough to abandon caution, an entire political system betting everything on one decisive battle, and then total collapse, up to 70,000 Romans killed in a single day. No modern nation could absorb that without shaking to its core, and Rome did shake. After Cannae, the Senate debated evacuation plans, allies openly discussed defection, priests reported bad omens, citizens expected Hannibal at the gates. This was the moment the world almost turned. If just a few more things had gone Hannibal's way, Rome might not have recovered. Stui, why Hannibal didn't march on? Rome. This is the question people ask the most. Why didn't Hannibal just march on Rome after Cannae? The simple answer sounds unsatisfying. He couldn't. But the deeper answer reveals everything about how wars actually work. Rome wasn't just a city. It was walls, reserves, politics, manpower, logistics, and belief. Hannibal had none of those things. He had a tired army, no siege equipment, no reinforcements, no guarantee that Rome's allies would fully defect. Marching on Rome would have meant gambling his entire force on a siege he couldn't sustain. If it failed, the war ended immediately. So Hannibal chose pressure instead of risk, and Rome chose survival instead of pride. That choice on both sides decided history. The allies who didn't fully commit. Here's something that doesn't get enough attention. Hannibal didn't lose because he lacked victories. He lost because his victories didn't translate into loyalty. Many Italian cities defected, but not enough. Many watched Rome bleed, but waited. Many hoped Hannibal would win, but refused to risk everything. Why? Because Rome had spent centuries building relationships, obligations, and fear. Rome punished betrayal, Rome rewarded loyalty, and Rome remembered. Hannibal needed a full collapse of Rome's alliance system. What he got instead was hesitation, and hesitation favors the defender. What if Carthage had truly backed him? Now let's ask the real what if. What if Carthage had fully supported Hannibal? Not partially, not politically, but completely. Imagine constant reinforcements sent to Italy, proper siege equipment delivered, a second army landing near Rome, unified command instead of divided politics. In that scenario, Rome would have faced pressure from every direction. The Fabian strategy might not have been enough. Rome's manpower advantage might have cracked. The Senate might have fractured. It's not impossible that Rome could have been forced into negotiation, or worse. This war wasn't lost because Hannibal lacked brilliance. It was lost because Carthage lacked commitment. A world without Roman dominance. Now let's go further. What if Rome had fallen or been permanently weakened? The Mediterranean wouldn't look the same. No Roman Empire. No Roman law spreading across Europe. No Latin language shaping Western civilization. No unified road system, administration, or legal tradition. Instead, a world dominated by regional powers, Carthaginian trade networks, Greek cultural influence lingering longer, fragmented political systems competing endlessly. Europe might never unify culturally. Christianity might never spread the same way. Modern Western governance might look completely different. Rome didn't just win a war. It accidentally shaped the future of half the planet. Why Rome ultimately survived. So why did Rome survive when so many others wouldn't? Not because of heroes, because of systems. Rome had redundant leadership, replaceable armies, political continuity, institutional memory. Lose one general. Replace him, lose one army, raise another. Lose one battle, change strategy. Hannibal was extraordinary. But Rome was durable, and durability beats brilliance over time. This war teaches a lesson that still applies today. You don't need to win every battle to win a war. You just need to avoid losing the one that ends everything. Rome learned how to lose without collapsing. That skill, more than any victory, is what made Rome unstoppable. Take a moment. Think about how close this all came to going the other way. One different decision, one stronger alliance, one political shift in Carthage, and the world you live in might not exist. History doesn't move forward because it's destined to. It moves forward because sometimes one side simply refuses to stop. Alright friends, by now, the Second Punic War feels finished. Hannibal is gone, Carthage is broken. Rome stands alone at the top of the Western Mediterranean. But here's the uncomfortable part of the story, the part Romans themselves didn't fully understand at the time. Winning this war changed Rome in ways it could never undo. And not all of those changes were good. Rome becomes addicted to winning. Before this war, Rome fought to survive. After this war, Rome fought because it could. Victory stopped feeling exceptional, it started feeling normal. And that's dangerous. When a society wins one massive existential war, it learns a powerful lesson. Wins. If we survived that, we can survive anything. That confidence slowly turns into appetite. New enemies didn't feel threatening anymore. They felt inevitable. Spain. Greece, Macedon, Asia Minor. Expansion stopped being defensive, it became routine. Rome didn't ask whether to fight anymore, only when. Generals learn a new lesson. The Second Punic War also taught Roman generals something critical. War wasn't just about protecting Rome, war was about personal legacy. Scipio Africanus didn't just defeat Hannibal, he became famous for it. Triumphs mattered, public recognition mattered. Political power followed military success. Young aristocrats watched this carefully. They learned that armies could bring votes, victories could silence rivals, soldiers could become loyal to commanders, not the state. This shift didn't destroy the Republic overnight, but it planted the idea that military glory could outrank civic duty. That idea never went away. The Republic starts to strain. Rome's political system was designed for a city-state, not a Mediterranean superpower. After the Second Punic War, Rome controlled territories far from Italy, places with different languages, cultures, and interests. Governors ruled these provinces with enormous autonomy. Corruption became easier, oversight became harder. Money flowed in, but so did inequality. The Senate struggled to manage problems it had never been built to solve. Rome wasn't collapsing, but it was stretching, and stretched systems eventually tear. And posvitishjan. The forgotten people. While elites debated policy and generals chased glory, ordinary Romans felt something else. Pressure. Jobs disappeared, land ownership declined. Urban poverty grew. Veterans wanted recognition and stability. The poor wanted food and work. And the political system moved slowly. This gap between what Rome promised its citizens and what it delivered kept widening. Later reformers like the Gracchi brothers would try to fix it. They would fail, violently. But again, the seeds were planted here. Carthage as a warning, not a rival. Carthage remained alive after the war, but powerless. And Rome didn't forget Hannibal. Roman senators spoke of Carthage with fear long after the threat was gone. Not because Carthage was strong, but because Rome remembered how close it came to losing everything. This fear hardened Roman policy. Mercy felt risky. Compromise felt weak. Eventually, Rome would decide that the safest enemy is a destroyed one. That decision leads directly to the Third Punic War, and the complete erasure of Carthage from the map. The Second Punic War traumatized Rome, collectively. Years of invasion, loss, and uncertainty left scars on the Roman mindset. Rome became more suspicious, more aggressive, less forgiving, more controlled. These traits helped Rome dominate, but they also made it brittle. Empires built on fear and momentum tend to struggle when expansion slows. Rome wouldn't face that problem for generations, but when it did, it wouldn't handle it well. Here's the truth. History doesn't say loudly enough. Rome didn't become great because it won the Second Punic War. Rome became unstoppable because it never allowed itself to feel safe again. That mindset drove expansion. That mindset built empire. That mindset also destroyed the Republic from the inside. Victory didn't end Rome's struggles. It simply postponed them and made them larger. This is the moment to slow the story down. To understand that the most important changes don't happen during battles. They happen afterward, in laws, in habits and expectations. The Second Punic War ended on a battlefield. Its consequences lasted for centuries. Alright, friends. By the time the Second Punic War faded into memory, Rome had already rewritten the story as a victory. And on the surface, that story made sense. Rome survived, Rome expanded. Rome dominated. But underneath that narrative, something quieter lingered. Rome never truly escaped Hannibal. Hannibal as a permanent fear. Long after Hannibal left Italy, Roman parents still used his name to scare their children. Hannibal is at the gates. It became a saying, a warning, a memory that refused to die. This wasn't about the man anymore. It was about what he represented. Hannibal proved that Rome could be. Outmaneuvered, outthought. Brought to the edge of extinction, Rome survived. but it never forgot how close the fall had been. That fear shaped every decision that followed. Adieu. Why Rome chose domination over balance before Hannibal, Rome accepted rivals. After Hannibal, Rome eliminated them. Balance felt unsafe, parity felt dangerous. If another power could grow strong enough to threaten Rome, then Rome had already failed. So Rome adopted a simple principle: no equal powers ever. This mindset explains the destruction of Carthage, the dismantling of Macedon, the slow absorption of the Greek world. Rome didn't conquer because it was cruel. Rome conquered because it was afraid. And the Hannibal problem. Here's something fascinating. Rome never produced another Hannibal-level threat from outside Italy again, but it eventually produced them from within. Men like Marius Sulla Pompey Caesar. These weren't foreign invaders. They were Roman commanders using Roman armies. The Senate had learned how to fear external enemies, but it never learned how to manage internal power. The lesson Hannibal taught Rome was misapplied, and that mistake would be fatal to the Republic. The shift in Roman identity. After the Second Punic War, Rome stopped seeing itself as one city among many and started seeing itself as the natural ruler of the Mediterranean. This identity shift mattered. When a society believes it is destined to rule, opposition feels illegitimate. Resistance feels rebellious. Criticism feels dangerous. Rome didn't become tyrannical overnight, but it became less tolerant of dissent, of rivals, of compromise. Hannibal's greatest victory. Here's the irony. Hannibal lost the war, but his impact outlasted every Roman general of his time. He forced Rome to militarize permanently, centralize authority, prioritize survival over tradition. In trying to prevent another Hannibal, Rome reshaped itself. And that reshaping eventually broke the Republic apart. Hannibal didn't conquer Rome, he changed it. Untie, a quiet connection across time. When Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon nearly 150 years later, he wasn't thinking about Hannibal. But the conditions that made Caesar possible were born in this war. Standing armies, personal loyalty to generals, fear-driven expansion, those were Hannibal's fingerprints, invisible but permanent. The war that never ended. The Second Punic War didn't end in 201 BC. It ended when Rome stopped expanding. And by then, Rome was no longer a republic in spirit, only in name. The war lived on, in policy, in fear, in ambition. Rome won the battlefield, but it lost its innocence. One last thought. If you ever wonder why Rome became an empire instead of remaining a republic, you don't need to start with Caesar. You start here, with a Carthaginian general who crossed the Alps and proved that Rome could bleed. Rome survived him, but it never recovered from the lesson. All right, friends, take a deep breath. We followed Hannibal across the Alps, tracked Scipio through Spain and Africa, witnessed battles that reshaped the Mediterranean, and walked through the quiet aftermath that defined Rome and Carthage. Now it's time to slow everything down. Not for action, not for strategy, not for victories or defeats, but for reflection. This is the moment where history stops being a sequence of events and becomes human, where it lives inside people's hearts, minds, and daily lives. The cost of victory. Rome won. On paper, the story is simple. Hannibal is defeated, Carthage is contained. Rome stands at the top of the Western Mediterranean, but victory comes at a cost, friends. And that cost is rarely measured in maps or treaties. It is measured in the lives, the habits, and the futures of ordinary people. Think about the soldiers. The men who survived treacherous mountain crossings, rivers filled with ice and blood, ambushes, starvation, and relentless campaigns. They returned home carrying invisible scars, nights haunted by the memories of friends lost, days filled with anxiety about farms lost, families in debt, or villages abandoned. Then think about the farmers, the craftsmen, the merchants, the families who waited at the doors. Some welcomed back sons and husbands, some never did. Fields remained untended, shops shuttered, neighborhoods hollowed out. Victory did not erase pain. Victory layered it with pride, necessity, and the belief that Rome was now destined to lead, to survive, to dominate. Rome's transformation. The Second Punic War didn't just reshape Rome externally, it reshaped it internally. Before Hannibal, Rome's republic functioned like a cautious city-state, mindful of threats, but restrained by tradition, law, and civic responsibility. After Hannibal, Rome became confident, and that confidence carried a hidden danger. Now Rome fought not merely to survive, but because it could. Expansion became a habit, Alliances were no longer balanced partnerships, they were instruments of control. The Mediterranean slowly started to feel less like a collection of independent states, and more like a stage for Roman influence. And the lessons learned during this war, both victories and failures, became ingrained in Roman political culture. Redundant military structures ensured armies could be replaced. Legal and social systems adapted to absorb losses without collapse. Leaders learned to value not just strategy but perception, influence, and the loyalty of troops. The Republic survived, but it changed. Its structures became stronger in some ways, weaker in others. The Second Punic War taught Rome that resilience, not brilliance, was the key to enduring power. The shadow of Hannibal. Even in defeat, Hannibal's presence lingered. Roman children grew up hearing stories of Hannibal at the gates. His march across the Alps became legend, a cautionary tale. Every Roman general, politician, and citizen carried the memory of what might have happened if Hannibal had succeeded. Rome's fear of external threats hardened into policy, shaping its response to rival powers for decades. Carthage was not merely defeated, it was watched, constrained, and systematically prevented from regaining strength. The Roman mindset shifted from caution to domination. Hannibal's greatest victory, in a sense, was permanent influence. He forced Rome to rethink, rebuild, and prepare in ways that defined its character for generations. Economic and social consequences. The war's cost wasn't just human, it was deeply structural. Land and agriculture. Many small farmers never returned to their land. Estates consolidated into fewer hands. Wealth concentrated, inequality rose. Labor and slavery. Rome captured countless prisoners, bringing them into servitude. Cheap labor shifted the economy, reduced opportunities for free citizens, and created social tension that would last for generations. Urban migration, displaced farmers and veterans flooded cities, changing demographics, increasing demand for grain, and forcing the government to intervene in new ways. Every city, village, and household bore a part of the war's impact. The echoes of Cannae, Trebia, and Zama were not just military, they were human, social, and economic. Political shifts and governance. The Republic's political system was designed for a smaller, simpler state. After Hannibal, it struggled with complexity. Governors in faraway provinces had more autonomy than ever before. Corruption increased. Local elites learned how to manipulate both the system and the citizens. Military power became closely tied to political influence. Success on the battlefield now translated into personal prestige and political leverage. Scipio Africanus, despite his heroism, eventually faced jealousy and suspicion. Rome's survival had created a paradox. The systems that allowed it to endure also generated tension between generals, the Senate, and the people. The human stories. Let's pause and think about the people whose stories aren't in history books. The widow in Capua whose husband fought at Cannae and never returned. The child in Spain witnessing Roman and Carthaginian armies marching past their village, wondering which side would destroy their home first. The Carthaginian merchant forced to pay tribute to Rome, quietly resenting the conquerors while keeping the city alive. These lives were reshaped forever. History remembers generals. History remembers battles. But it is lived day by ordinary people. The lessons of strategy and adaptation. Hannibal's brilliance almost destroyed Rome. Scipio's adaptability saved it, but Rome's lasting lesson wasn't about genius. It was about systems. Resilience beats brilliance over time. Patience can outlast aggression. A society that adapts survives. One that rests on laurels does not. These lessons were applied not just in military campaigns, but in governance, law, and civic life. They echo into the future, shaping Rome's empire and indirectly influencing Western civilization for millennia. Reflection on legacy. Take a moment. Imagine the alternative world. If Hannibal had captured Rome, if Carthage had fully supported him, if Roman allies had abandoned the Republic, Europe might never have been unified under Roman law and culture. The Mediterranean could have remained a fragmented collection of city-states. The spread of Latin, Roman engineering, and Roman law might never have occurred. Victory and defeat are never just about the battlefield. They are about the ripples that touch every part of human life. Closing scenes. Visualized. As you watch the final images in your mind, Rome's streets at dusk, quiet but alive. Fields slowly recovering from years of neglect. Carthage's harbor empty, yet still standing. Soldiers walking home, faces lined with exhaustion, eyes reflecting memories no one can erase. Mountains Hannibal crossed, silent under the sun, reminders of endurance, strategy, and human courage. History is not just what happened, it is what remains. It is in the people, the cities, the traditions, and the fear that shapes every decision. Final thought. The Second Punic War didn't just end in 201 BC. It never truly ended. It lived on in Rome's political decisions, its military strategies, its culture, and its mindset. It lived on in Carthage's destruction and Hannibal's enduring reputation. It lives on today, in every lesson we take from history, in the choices of leaders, and in the human cost of ambition. Rome survived Hannibal. Carthage endured in memory, if not in power. Hannibal's shadow stretched far beyond his lifetime. And here, in the quiet reflection, we see that history is not just about battles. It is about people, choices, endurance, and the echoes of every action across generations. Alright friends, if you're still here, then you already understand something important. This was never just a war. It was a long, exhausting human experience that stretched across decades, continents, and entire lifetimes. And now, finally, it comes to rest. Not with noise, not with celebration, but with quiet understanding. Because that's how most real stories end. When the fighting finally stopped, after years of marching armies, burned fields, broken alliances, and fear that never fully left Italy, the Second Punic War simply ended. No trumpet announced it. No crowd truly understood what had just happened. The battle stopped first. Then the movement of armies slowed. Then, gradually, the world noticed the silence. Rome stood, Carthage survived, barely. Hannibal walked away, and everyone on both sides was left with the same question. What did all of this actually change? Rome's victory didn't feel like joy. Rome had won the greatest war it had ever fought. But victory didn't feel like relief. It felt like exhaustion. Too many sons never returned. Too many farms were empty. Too many memories refused to fade. Rome didn't celebrate the end of the war the way it celebrated smaller victories. There was no single moment of release, only a slow realization that the threat was gone. And when people finally allowed themselves to breathe again, they noticed something unsettling. They were not the same people anymore. A republic that learned to fear before Hannibal, Rome feared defeat. After Hannibal, Rome feared survival without control. The war taught Rome that being strong was not enough. Being brave was not enough. Even tradition was not enough. What mattered was never being vulnerable again. That fear reshaped Roman thinking. Rivals could not be tolerated. Balance of power felt dangerous. Mercy felt risky. Delay felt safer than boldness. Rome became cautious in a way that looked like confidence from the outside. But inside, it was fear that never truly went away. Uneigel. The ordinary soldiers think about the men who fought this war. Not the generals, not the senators. The ordinary soldiers. They returned home carrying years of hunger, violence, and loss inside them. Many had marched across Italy more times than they could remember. Many had watched entire units disappear in moments. They were welcomed as heroes, but no one knew what to do with them afterward. There was no language for trauma, no understanding of psychological scars, so they tried to live normal lives. Some succeeded, many didn't. Their silence became part of Rome's culture, a quiet acceptance that suffering was simply the cost of survival. Rome's society begins to shift. The war changed how Rome worked, not just how it fought. Small farmers lost land they could no longer maintain. Wealth concentrated in fewer hands. Cities filled with displaced citizens looking for work. Slavery expanded, inequality deepened. The Republic still functioned, but the balance it once relied on was slipping. Rome had won control of the Mediterranean, but it was slowly losing internal stability. No one noticed right away. These changes happened quietly. Carthage's survival wasn't freedom. Carthage lived on after the war, but only in form. Its empire was gone. Its military power was broken. Its independence existed only because Rome allowed it. Carthage became a reminder, both to itself and to Rome. To Carthage, it was a reminder of humiliation and restraint. To Rome, it was a reminder of fear. Rome could not forget how close Carthage had come to destroying it. And fear, once planted, grows roots. Hannibal's final legacy. Hannibal lost the war, but history did not forget him. His name became legend, not because he won, but because he nearly did. Rome remembered him not as a defeated enemy, but as a warning. He proved that Rome was not invincible, and that single truth changed everything. Rome spent the rest of its history trying to make sure no one like Hannibal ever appeared again, outside or inside its borders. Ironically, that effort would eventually destroy the Republic itself. A world quietly redirected. The Second Punic War did not reshape the world overnight, it reshaped it slowly. Because Rome survived, Roman law spread across Europe. Roman roads connected distant lands. Roman governance influenced future states. Latin shaped entire languages. Because Hannibal failed, trade-based empires lost ground. Military states gained dominance. Balance gave way to control. This war quietly decided which kind of civilization would dominate the Western world. Here is the truth that history books rarely admit. Rome was traumatized by its own survival. Years of fear don't disappear when danger ends. They settle into habits, institutions, and expectations. Rome became powerful, but restless. Confident, but never relaxed. The Republic carried the weight of its own victory, and eventually it would collapse under that weight. The path to empire began not with ambition, but with fear. As this story ends, imagine this: a Roman road stretching into the distance at sunset. Fields slowly recovering from neglect. A quiet harbor in Carthage, ships rocking gently. The Alps standing silent long after Hannibal crossed them. An old veteran staring into a fire, remembering battles no one asks about anymore. No celebration, no victory music, just time moving forward. The Second Punic War did not end with a shout. It ended with a long exhale. Rome survived and in doing so changed forever. Carthage endured, until history returned later to finish the story. Hannibal lived on, not in triumph but in memory. And the world continued, shaped by choices made under impossible pressure. That's how history really works. Not in moments of glory, but in the quiet aftermath that follows.